It started with a dusty shoebox my sister threw in the trash while she was pretending to grieve. Before that day ended, I knew I would watch her lose everything. She thought she had erased the only evidence of her plan to strip me of every dollar I had poured into that house over 15 years. She did not know that box was the fuse on a slow-burning bomb that would end with her in handcuffs, her husband bankrupt, and a brass plaque bearing her name on the wall of a home for seniors whose families had abandoned them. My name is Claire, at least for this story. For most of my adult life, I was the one who stayed. I was a residential contractor by trade, a woman who could frame a load-bearing wall before breakfast and read a general ledger with the same fluency I brought to soldering a copper supply line. When my father died 23 years ago, I was already living in the garage apartment of my mother's small 1940s bungalow on Sycamore Street, having returned after a divorce that left me with a single suitcase, a set of Makita cordless tools, and the conviction that I would never again depend on anyone else's promises. My mother, Rose, was a retired school librarian with a spine of steel and a filing system that would make an archivist weep. She had inherited that bungalow from her own parents, a tidy clapboard house with oak floors that had been sanded so many times the nails were beginning to show their polished heads, a built-in china cabinet with wavy glass that held her collection of ironstone platters, and a deep backyard where she grew Brandywine tomatoes from seeds she had saved every August for 40 years. It was the only asset of any real value our family held, assessed at approximately $380,000, free and clear of any mortgage. Over the next 15 years, I poured $90,000 of my own savings into making that house safe for her to age in place. The money went into materials and skilled labor I could not do alone, but I did the majority of the work myself, often arriving at dawn with a thermos of coffee and leaving after the sun had set behind the neighbor's cedar hedge. The smell of fresh-cut lumber and the gritty dust of drywall compound were as familiar to me as the scent of her lavender sachets. Each project was a kind of love letter written in sweat and precise measurements, a way of telling her that she would never have to leave the rooms where she had raised us, no matter how frail she became. I replaced the entire electrical panel, swapping the old 60-amp fuse box for a 200-amp square DQO panel with arc fault breakers for the bedrooms and dedicated circuits for the medical equipment she would eventually need. I installed a stairlift with a dedicated 20-amp circuit, so it would not trip the breaker every time the microwave ran, and I ran the low-voltage wiring myself, pulling a control cable through the attic and down the wall cavity with a fiberglass fish tape that left a faint trail of luminous dust on my gloves. I built a zero-threshold roll-in shower with a linear drain and slip-resistant mosaic tile rated at a coefficient of friction above 0.6, the grout sealed with a penetrating sealer I reapplied every 18 months like clockwork. I widened every interior door frame to 36 inches clear, which meant pulling the casing, cutting the jack studs with a reciprocating saw, and rehanging the doors on offset hinges with 3.5-inch screws that bit deep into the king studs. I replaced the entire cast-iron plumbing stack after it rusted through in the crawlspace, the old pipe crumbling in my hands like a rotten log, and I put on a new architectural shingle roof, rated for 30 years with a synthetic underlayment and an ice and water shield along the eaves, because our winters had started icing heavier. I built a ramp from the back door to the garden, pressure-treated lumber on helical piles. I drove with a rented torque head, the slope a precise 1:12 ratio. And I did all this because she was my mother, because I had the skills, and because I believed that family was a contract you signed in blood and honored in sweat. My sister Elaine showed up exactly twice during that decade and a half. The first time was 8 years in, when she flew in from Phoenix with her husband Brett for what they called a family emergency, which turned out to be a high-pressure pitch for me to lend them $3,000 for a down payment on a timeshare presentation they had already attended and needed to finalize, to unlock some imaginary bonus vacation. They sat in my mother's living room while Mom was napping, Brett wearing a polo shirt with a car wash chain logo, his smile a little too wide, explaining how the real estate market in Cabo was about to explode, and if we just acted now, we could all benefit. I wrote the check not because I believed them, but because Elaine had mastered the art of invoking our shared childhood, the bunk beds we had shared, the way she used to braid my hair before school, and I was still naive enough to think that money could buy a relationship the same way cedar shims could close a gap in a door frame. They left the next morning. The timeshare never closed. The money vanished. The second visit was 3 years ago, when Elaine breezed in for a single afternoon. Mom was bedridden by then, and Elaine took a selfie with her using a ring light she had brought in her purse, a small circular LED that clamped onto her phone. She captioned it, "Family is everything," on a social media feed she curated like a museum diorama, and then deleted it 2 hours later when she realized the lighting made her look tired. She did not stay for dinner. She did not meet the evening nurse. She hugged me in the driveway and said, "You're so strong, I don't know how you do it." And then she climbed into the passenger seat of Brett's leased Escalade and was gone before the taillights cleared the corner. Brett managed a chain of automated car washes that stretched across 3 counties, and he treated debt like a subscription service, always rolling one liability into the next, always leasing a new luxury SUV the moment the old one hit 30,000 miles. His business, Car Shine Holdings, was a shell game of franchise fees, equipment loans, and revolving credit lines that I would later learn were held together by little more than forged signatures, and the desperate hope that one more quarter of rain-free weather would float them out of the hole. Mom passed on a Tuesday in early October, 2 weeks after a fall that her geriatrician said would have been unsurvivable regardless of intervention. I was the one holding her hand at Mercy General, sitting in a vinyl chair that had molded to my body over 6 days of vigil. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint floral sachet I had pinned to her pillow, a little cloth bag of dried lavender from her own garden. She had stopped speaking 2 days before, but in the final hour her eyes opened, clear and brown like polished walnut, and she looked at me with an expression I could not decode, something between apology and warning. I told her I loved her. I told her the tomatoes would come in nicely next year. Then her breathing changed, a series of shallow catches, and the monitor flatlined with a single sustained tone that the nurse silenced before it could become an accusation. I folded her hand over her chest and I closed my eyes. The machine's quiet stayed with me for the rest of that week, a heavy silence like walking through a house after all the tools have been put away. I remember thinking that the worst part was not the silence itself, but the way it erased the background hum of her presence, the small sounds that had defined my life for so long, the shuffle of her slippers on the hardwood floor, the click of her knitting needles, the soft exhale she made when she sat down with a book. The next morning the vultures circled. Elaine and Brett arrived at the bungalow before the funeral home had even finished filing the death certificate. I had slept maybe 3 hours, curled on the couch in my mother's Afghan blanket, and I woke to the sound of a key in the front door, a key I had not given them. Elaine swept in wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that I later found out retailed for more than my last dumpster rental, and the 2 weeks of materials for a kitchen upgrade. Her hair was blown out into a smooth curtain, and she was already speaking into her phone at a volume calibrated to project authority, telling someone on the other end that, "We need to move fast, the market's hot right now." Brett followed with a roll of black contractor bags under his arm and a clipboard in his hand, his expression that of a shift manager about to conduct a surprise inspection. They did not hug me, they did not offer condolences. Elaine said, "Claire, we need to get this house ready for probate. A cluttered house photographs poorly, and the listing photos go up next week." Then she started directing Brett. She pointed at the bookshelves first, the ones I had built from reclaimed fur, and said to bag up the paperbacks. Nobody wants mildewed romance novels. Then the photo albums on the coffee table, those thick, sticky-paged volumes with black and white snapshots of our parents' wedding, our childhood Christmas mornings. Brett piled them into a trash bag without looking at a single page. I stood by the window with my arms crossed, my tool-stained jeans still carrying the grit of the hospital parking lot, and I watched them purge my mother's life, as if they were clearing a storage unit before an auction. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the sound of albums hitting the plastic bag was like the thud of earth on a coffin lid. I felt a cold, slow anger taking root behind my sternum, but I kept my face blank. I knew that to protest would be to reveal that I was paying attention, and I needed them to believe I was too broken to fight. Elaine moved to the hallway closet and began pulling things off the shelf. Old tax files, the folders color-coded with tabs my mother had typed on a manual typewriter, a cardboard box of electrical bills from the 1990s, organized by year with those little metal tabs our mother used. My mother's knitting bag, the one with the wooden handles and the half-finished scarf still on the needles, the yarn a soft heather grey she had been saving for a project she never named, and then the shoebox. It was white with a blue lid, the kind that once held a pair of Keds, and it was labelled in my mother's neat ballpoint cursive, Taxes 1998. Elaine popped the lid, the cardboard giving a soft release of air. She riffled through a few envelopes, saw a VHS tape and what looked like old dividend statements, and held it out toward Brett with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "That's junk," she said, and Brett opened a black bag and she dropped it in. The thud of shoebox meeting plastic was muffled but definitive, the sound of an eraser hitting a chalkboard. I said nothing. I stood at the window, hands in my pockets, and I let them bury what they wanted to bury. Later that evening, after their rented Tahoe had pulled away to a hotel where they were drafting the first version of their narrative for the extended family, I walked to the curb in the dark. The city bins had been rolled out for collection the next morning, but I pulled the black bag from the top, the plastic cold and slick with dew. I carried it back inside, locked the door, and sat cross-legged on my mother's braided rug in the living room, the one she had made from worn-out wool skirts during the long winters before cable television. The rug still smelled faintly of cedar from the Hope chest where she had kept it. I opened the shoebox. The water-damaged Form 1090 IVs fluttered to the side. Beneath them, resting on a folded piece of felt that looked like it had been cut from an old coat lining, was the tape. The white adhesive label bore blue ink, my mother's handwriting, and 3 words: "For Claire Play Alone." The camcorder was still in the hall closet, a chunky Sony Handycam from the mid-90s that recorded onto VHS-C cassettes. I had kept it charged because I had once promised to digitize the old family videos, a box of memories I had never found the time to transfer. It was the kind of promise you make when you think you have forever. I pulled the Handycam from its worn nylon case, its plastic shell scuffed from 100 birthday parties and school plays, and plugged its AC adapter into the wall outlet by the television. I blew the dust out of the tape well with a can of compressed air I used for cleaning sawdust out of my miter saw, the jet stirring up a small cloud that glittered in the lamplight. The machine's buttons were stiff from age, but when I slid the cassette home and pressed play through the fuzzy on-screen menu, the mechanism engaged with a whir and a click. The screen flickered, static hissing, and then my mother's face filled the frame. She was sitting up in her bed, the Detroit Tigers pennant hanging crooked behind her on the wall. I recognized the nightgown immediately. It was the one she wore the week after her hip surgery 4 years ago, the week they had loaded her on a cocktail of hydromorphone and lorazepam that left her barely able to hold a spoon. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles, but they were fixed on the lens with a desperation that cut through the medication haze like a flashlight beam through fog. Her hands trembled in her lap, the knuckles swollen and pale. She cleared her throat twice, a dry, papery sound, and then she spoke, her voice cracked but deliberate, the way people sound when they have rehearsed a plea they hope will never be needed. "Claire, if you're watching this, I'm probably gone, and they are coming for the house. Elaine made me sign something while I was on that pain medication after the surgery. She told me it was just a form to update my insurance. I couldn't read it, my hands were shaking, but she guided my hand. I said no, but Brett held my wrist. I said no 3 times, but Brett pressed the pen into my fingers and moved my hand like I was a puppet. The pen felt cold. I could smell his cologne, something sharp and cheap. I was so scared, honey. I couldn't scream because my throat was dry from the anesthesia and my voice came out as a whisper. They kept telling me it was for my own good. Don't trust them. Save yourself, there's more in the safety deposit box. Key is taped inside the back cover of my Bible, the one on the nightstand. I love you. Don't let them win. The recording clicked off and the screen went to black. I sat in the silence of that empty house, the afterimage of her terrified face burned behind my eyelids. I rewound the tape and watched it again, and again until I could recite every syllable, until the grief hardened into something else, something with a load-bearing capacity. I remember thinking that the woman in that video was not my mother, the librarian, the keeper of quiet order, but a woman who had summoned her last ounce of strength to leave a trail of breadcrumbs through a dark forest, and that it was now my job to follow them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a lifetime of quiet sacrifice should count for more than a last-minute signature made under duress. Within 48 hours, Elaine and Brett had produced the new will. They did not bring it to the house, where I might have had allies or witnesses. Instead, they summoned me to a strip mall law office on the edge of town, a place called Federated Legal Services, which I later learned was not a real firm, but a document preparation shop that rented conference rooms by the hour. The office smelled of burnt coffee from a drip machine that had not been cleaned since the first Bush administration, and the air freshener plug-in by the baseboard was a cloying vanilla that coated the back of my throat. The carpet was industrial, flattened into a grease-darkened path between the door and the fake wood conference table. Brett did most of the talking, his voice running through the room like a defective sump pump, while Elaine sat beside him in a dark navy dress, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she never actually used. Her tears were a performance so precise, I could almost see the stage directions printed on the inside of her eyelids. They explained that Mom had revised her estate plan 6 weeks before her fall, in a moment of clarity, and that the document superseded everything prior. The new will, which Brett slid across the table in a glossy black report cover, left me nothing. Not the house, not the furniture, not a single photograph. The entire estate, specifically the real property at 442 Sycamore Street, was bequeathed to Elaine Marie Carlson in fee simple absolute. I asked to see the original. The paper was flimsy, £20 bond at best, the kind you buy in reams at an office supply store, not the heavier linen finish my mother always used for important documents. The watermark was generic, and the edges were not deckled. The signature at the bottom was a jagged line, a seismograph of a hand being moved while the signer was unconscious. It looked like the pen had been dragged across the page by someone who had no control over the pressure or direction, the way a child might trace a line while someone else held their wrist. The notary seal belonged to a mobile notary named Lori Bienkowski, a name I had never heard. I excused myself to the restroom, a single stall with a sink that dripped, and I pulled out my phone. The search took 30 seconds. Lori Bienkowski was the sister of Brett's regional operations manager, a man named Todd Bienkowski who had been cited in a local business journal as the operations backbone of Coercion Holdings. The connection was too clean, too convenient, like a doorknob that turns with no resistance because the latch has been taped open. I took a screenshot of the search result, the blue hyperlink and the grainy photo of Todd shaking hands at a car wash opening, and I emailed it to myself before flushing the toilet for sound effect. I swallowed every instinct to scream. I had spent 20 years on construction sites, negotiating with subs who padded change orders and clients who withheld final payments. I knew how to read a bluff and I knew when to fold a hand. I let my eyes go glassy. I let my shoulders slump forward, letting the bones in my spine curve like a stud wall that had taken too much load. I breathed shallowly through my mouth and I said, in a voice I barely recognized, that I was too tired to process anything, that grief had hollowed me out, that I just needed someone to take care of things. I used the word foggy, and I saw Elaine's eyes flick to Brett's, a microsecond of triumphant calculation. Of course, she said, her voice dipping into a register of performative concern that was about 2 octaves above genuine. You can stay with us while we get the house ready for sale. You shouldn't be alone, not after all you've been through. We have a guest room, you'll be so comfortable. What she meant was that they could isolate me, control my access to documents, and present me to the probate court as a grief-stricken, incapacitated sibling who needed a guardian to manage her affairs. I heard it all, every subtextual note, the way you hear the faint ping of a nail hitting a pipe inside a wall. I said yes. I said thank you. I said I did not know what I would do without family. I packed a single suitcase and a cardboard box, bringing only what they would approve. A few changes of clothes, some toiletries, my mother's Bible and the shoebox, which I had repacked with the tape, my small tool roll, a portable light pad for tracing, a set of lockpicking tools from my job site kit, and a digital camera I used for documenting before and after photos of renovations. I slid the shoebox into the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old sweaters, and I climbed into the back seat of their Escalade. They thought I was signing up for assisted surrender. I was signing up for a residency at the crime scene. As the car pulled out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the bungalow through the rear window, the porch light my mother had left on for decades now dark, and I made a silent promise to every board and nail in that house that I would return. Their house was a 5-bedroom McMansion in a gated subdivision called Oakmont Estates, a name that suggested rolling meadows, but delivered a grid of stucco facades, each one identical, except for the color of the accent shutters. The great room had a vaulted ceiling with recessed can lights that buzzed slightly on a dimmer switch, and the furniture was a neutral palette of beige and grey, as if the entire house had been staged by a realtor with an allergy to personality. The guest room they gave me was off the kitchen, previously a home office they had hastily emptied. The dust outline of the old desk was still visible on the carpet, a rectangle of unfaded fibers, and the indentations where a filing cabinet had sat pressed into the pile like fossilized footprints. They had removed the filing cabinet, but they had left behind a single plastic wastebasket, which threw a shadow on the wall from the overhead fluorescent fixture. It was a room designed for surveillance, whether they knew it or not. The door was a flimsy hollow-core slab that transmitted sound like a drum skin, and the wall adjacent to the kitchen island was uninsulated, So every conversation held at the bar stools arrived in my room as if the speakers were standing at my elbow. I unpacked my few things, hung my clothes in the empty closet that still smelled of dry, cleaning plastic, and placed my mother's Bible on the nightstand, the leather cover warm under my palm. The investigation began the first morning, the way a carpenter begins any project, by measuring twice. I started by listening. Brett took his business calls pacing the open-concept great room, his voice dropping low when he discussed the draw schedule and that balloon payment on the credit line. I heard phrases like, "We just need the title to clear before the audit," and "they can't freeze what they can't find offshore," and I wrote them down in a small spiral notebook I kept tucked in my waistband, using a shorthand I had developed for materials takeoffs. I also began noting patterns. Brett's calls to a certain number always happened after 5 p.m., and his tone shifted from bluster to pleading. One afternoon, I heard him on the phone with someone he called Covington, his voice tight and pleading. He kept saying, "The house will cover it, I just need another 30 days. You can't put a lien on a property that's about to be sold. You'll spook the title company." The name Covington matched a debt collection firm I had seen on a letter in his wastebasket later. I learned that Brett's entire financial architecture was a house of cards mortared with fraudulent signatures. Elaine spent hours on her laptop at the kitchen island, logging into accounts she never realized I could see reflected in the glass of the built-in oven door across the room. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to refill my water glass, and she was studying a spreadsheet with blue and gold formatting, the letters Hellock visible in the corner cell. I recognized the structure immediately. It was an amortization table for a home equity line of credit, the kind lenders generate to show interest-only payment periods and draw schedules. The property address at the top was 442 Sycamore Street. The borrower name was my mother's, but the applicant field showed my own name, Claire Bennett, with a signature in a loopy cursive that was not mine. My signature is a scrawl, honed on lien waivers and change orders, blocky and angled. This one had a curlicue on the C and no slash through the T. I filed the image like a photograph of an unpermitted wall built over a live junction box, knowing I would need to open it up later. Elaine slammed the laptop shut and asked if I wanted herbal tea. I said yes, chamomile, and I memorized every character of the account number I had glimpsed. While the kettle heated, I made a point of appearing to stare vacantly out the window, but in the reflection I watched her reopen the laptop and type a password, her fingers moving in a pattern I noted. 6 characters, then a pause, then 4 more. I stored that away too. 3 days into my stay, the guest bathroom supply line gave out. It was a classic mid-century plumbing failure, a galvanized steel nipple connecting the angle stop to the fixture that had corroded from the inside out over decades, forming a blister of rust that finally burst. Water sprayed across the travertine tile at 40 pounds per square inch, a cold hard jet that soaked the baseboards and started pooling toward the hallway carpet. Brett screamed, his voice cracking into a register I had never heard, and he yelled for Elaine to call an emergency plumber, who would charge $200 an hour plus a holiday surcharge because it was a Friday afternoon. I walked into the bathroom, the water cascading over my bare feet, and I reached under the pedestal sink and shut off the angle stop with a quarter turn of the metal handle. The spray died. Drips continued from the pipe, but the immediate flood stopped. I said, "I can fix this," and Brett and Elaine stared at me as if I had offered to perform a root canal. I retrieved my tool roll from the bottom of my box, unrolling it on the wet tile. I had a small pipe wrench, a keyhole saw, a MAP gas torch, a coil of lead-free solder, a tin of flux, a wire brush, and a selection of Type L copper fittings. I was missing a section of replacement pipe, but I knew Brett's garage held a scrap pile from a previous contractor's aborted bathroom remodel, including a length of half-inch copper I had noticed while they were showing me the house. I cut open the drywall behind the pedestal sink with the keyhole saw, finding the stud cavity and the source nipple, a 6-inch piece of threaded galvanized that had turned to orange lace. I unthreaded it with the pipe wrench, the corroded threads squealing as they turned, and I cleaned the exposed brass of the angle stop with the wire brush until it shone. The new brass nipple from my spares kit went in smoothly, and I wrapped the threads with Teflon tape, 3 clockwise revolutions as the manufacturer specifies, then tightened it until the torque felt right, about 2.5 turns past hand tight. I cut the scrap copper to length with a tubing cutter I found under Brett's workbench, reamed the interior burr, and dry fit the assembly before soldering. I heated the joint with the MAP torch, the blue cone of the flame dancing on the copper until the metal shifted to a dull rose. I touched the solder to the opposite side of the joint, and it wickered around in a perfect silver ring, the flux sizzling. I wiped the joint with a damp rag while it was still plastic to smooth the bead, then let it cool. I pressure tested the line by opening the angle stop slowly, watching for drips, and then I mixed a batch of 5-minute hot mud compound from a bag I had found in their garage, patching the drywall in 2 coats with a 6-inch knife, feathering the edges into the surrounding texture. I sanded it lightly, primed it with a rattle can of spray primer, and touched up the paint with a color-matched sample I had in my kit from my mother's house, a light eggshell that was close enough to pass. The whole job took 70 minutes, start to finish. Brett watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression shifting from panic to something else, something I could not name at the time but later recognized as the quiet terror of a man who has just discovered that the person he intends to frame for fraud knows exactly how to dismantle his world with her bare hands. Elaine busied herself with a rag wiping up water I had already contained, and I noticed she would not meet my eyes. That night, after they had gone to bed and the house settled into the low hum of its HVAC system, I examined the office they kept locked. The door was at the end of the hallway leading from the great room, a hollow-core interior slab painted the same grade as the walls, with a cheap quickset knob, a wafer lock mechanism that I could have opened with a bobby pin if I had had one, but I used the proper tools instead. I had learned lockpicking 20 years earlier on a job site when a client had lost the key to their electrical panel on a Sunday, and the power company was charging $1,000 for an emergency disconnect. The skill had never left me. I knelt in the hallway, the carpet pressing marks into my knees, and I inserted my tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, a thin piece of spring steel I had filed from a feeler gauge. I applied light rotational pressure counterclockwise, just enough to bind the first pin, and then I slid my rake pick, a Bogota-style triple peak, over the pins 3 times. On the third rake the plug rotated, a soft click that travelled up through the pick into my fingertips. I held the tension, turned the knob, and the door swung open without a sound. My heart hammered, but my hands were steady, the same way they are when setting a circular saw blade to the correct depth. The office was a monument to paper-based fraud. A 2-drawer lateral file cabinet labelled Car Wash Tax Docs sat against the far wall beneath a window with closed blinds. The top drawer slid open on smooth ball-bearing slides, and inside I found hanging folders stuffed with promissory notes, photocopies of cashier's checks, and a folder marked Rose Hellock. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. Inside was the full documentation for a $160,000 home equity line of credit taken out against my mother's house, dated 11 months earlier. There was a uniform residential loan application, a HUD-1 settlement statement, a truth in lending disclosure, and a copy of a durable power of attorney that named me as the attorney-in-fact for my mother, empowering me to sell, encumber, or dispose of any real property on her behalf. My signature was on that power of attorney, a forgery that would have taken a forensic document examiner about 90 seconds to dismantle. The forger had copied the general shape of my name, but had missed the distinctive hard angle of my capital C, which I form with a straight vertical stroke followed by a curved top, and the way I cross my T with a horizontal slash that descends slightly from left to right, a habit I picked up from years of marking lumber with a carpenter's pencil. I photographed every page with my digital camera, the flash off, using the ambient light from the desk lamp. I made sure to capture the stippled texture of the paper, the slight shadow under the notary stamp, and the tiny inkjet printer dots that would reveal the document had been printed on a machine in that very house. Then I lifted the keyboard pad to check for hidden notes, finding nothing, and moved to the wastebasket. The wastebasket was a black plastic cylinder, half full of crumpled paper and junk mail, but beneath that layer sat a glossy paper shopping bag from a high-end boutique, the kind with rope handles and a magnetic closure. Inside the bag, Brett had dumped the output of a cross-cut shredder. The pieces were confetti-sized, diamond-shaped fragments about 1/4 inch by 3/8, not the spaghetti strands of a strip-cut machine. Cross-cut shredding is more secure, but it is not impossible to reconstruct if you have time, a steady hand, and the right tools. I hefted the bag, estimating it weighed about 2 pounds, and I carried it back to my guest room, closing the office door behind me and relocking it from the outside with a quick rake of the same pick. I moved silently, the carpet muffling my footsteps, and I could hear the distant drone of a television in the master suite, a late-night talk show laugh track that covered any creak of the floor. For the next 2 nights I reconstructed the documents on the guest room floor. I used the portable light pad from my toolkit, a thin LED panel I normally used for tracing tile layouts onto transfer paper. I laid it flat on the carpet, covered it with a sheet of clear acetate to protect the surface, and then I poured the shreds into a shallow plastic tray, the kind used for developing photographs. I worked in sections, sorting the fragments by color and font type: white paper with black laser printer text, white paper with blue ballpoint handwriting, yellow paper with green ledger lines. The sorting alone took 4 hours, my fingers working under the magnifying lamp I had clipped to the nightstand, separating shards with the kind of patience I had learned from matching wood grain on a patch. I used fine-point tweezers from my electrical kit, the kind for placing jumper wires on circuit boards, and acid-free document repair tape, the same tape I used for patching torn blueprints. The trick with cross-cut shreds is to find the straight edges first, the ones that form the margins of the original page, and build inward. I started with what I thought was a letter, because I found a date field in the upper right corner and a line. Slowly, like assembling a puzzle with no picture on the box, the document emerged: a wire transfer confirmation from First Midwest Trust to an account at the Cayman National Bank, the beneficiary a shell corporation named Coercion Holdings LLC. The amount was $47,000. The second document, printed on the same flimsy paper as the new will, was a draft of that will with handwritten margin notes in Brett's penmanship. I recognized his handwriting from a birthday card he had once sent, the lowercase e's that looked like open loops. The margin notes read: change POA clause to exclude sister, and notary, Laurie, stamp date retroactive to August 3. The third document was a letter from a debt collection firm, Covington and Associates, addressed to Brett personally and referencing a defaulted loan on a timeshare in Cabo San Lucas, the same one Elaine had borrowed $3,000 from me to pursue. The letter threatened litigation, wage garnishment, and the filing of a UCC-1 lien on any real property Brett held, which explained why the house on Sycamore Street was so crucial. They needed it free and clear, either to sell or to use as collateral for a consolidation loan, because their personal assets were already encumbered. The motive was no longer ambiguous. They were drowning, they needed the house, and they needed me to take the legal fall for the Hellock, because my forged signature made me the financially responsible party if the scheme collapsed. As I pieced together the final shred of that letter, the one with the Covington letterhead, my hands stilled. I could feel the full weight of their plans settling into my bones, and I realized that the family I had bled for had been plotting my destruction with the same casual efficiency they used to order takeout. I still needed the second piece of evidence my mother had promised, the one in the safety deposit box. Back in my mother's bedroom, the day before I had moved into the McMansion, I had done what her video instructed. Her Bible, a heavy leather-bound King James with gold leaf edges and a cracked spine from decades of daily use, sat on her nightstand where it always had. I had peeled back the marbled paper pastidown inside the back cover, careful not to tear the delicate paper that had yellowed at the corners, and taped there was a small brass safety deposit key, bright and uncorroded, and a slip of paper with the name First Midwest Trust and a box number 1472. I had brought the Bible with me, wrapped in a sweater and tucked at the bottom of my box. Now, on a Friday when Elaine and Brett were both at what they said was a business meeting, but what I suspected was actually a meeting with a bankruptcy attorney, I drove to the bank. It was a low brick building on the historic Main Street, with a terrazzo floor and a vault door that looked like it had been fabricated during the Coolidge administration. I presented my identification and the key to a vault attendant, a young woman in a grey suit who checked a signature card, and compared my face to my driver's license. She led me into the vault, a long narrow room lined with brass-fronted boxes, the air cool and dry with the particular scent of old paper and machine oil. She inserted her guard key and my client key simultaneously, twisted, and pulled out the long metal drawer. Then she left me alone in a small private booth with a table, a chair, and a box of tissues. Inside box 1472 I found 3 items: a second VHS tape labelled in my mother's hand, to be viewed with Claire, a notarized letter on heavy linen paper, the same quality my mother always used for her personal correspondence, the edges deckled, and a thick manila envelope clasped shut. I opened the letter first, my hands trembling slightly in a way they had not since I had run my first table saw. The letter was dated 6 months before Mom's death, before the hip surgery, while she was still fully cognitively intact as confirmed by a Mini-Mental State Examination score of 29 out of 30, the results of which were attached on a separate sheet from her geriatrician's office, signed by a real doctor with a real NPI number. The letter stated in unambiguous language: I, Rosemary Bennett, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that any testamentary document signed on or after July 15 of this year, without the presence of my attorney, Harold Harleys Esq., is the product of undue influence and shall be void. I further declare that my daughter Claire Bennett has spent over $90,000 of her personal funds on the maintenance and accessibility modifications of my home at 442 Sycamore Street, and I direct my executor to reimburse her from the estate or to convey the property to her in satisfaction of that debt. This letter shall serve as a codicil to any will and shall override any conflicting provision. Below the text was my mother's signature, strong and sure, with the familiar little flourish on the R in rose. The notary seal was from a different notary entirely, a woman who had worked at the public library where my mother volunteered. I knew her. She had no connection to Brett's business. The manila envelope contained meticulous records. Every invoice I had ever given my mother for the renovations, receipts from the lumber yard and the plumbing supply house, cancelled checks from my account to the contractors, all organized in plastic sleeves by date and annotated in her handwriting with little notes like, "Claire paid for this roof. Full amount, no help from Elaine and bathroom remodel, Claire's labor, saved me $8,000. She had been building an evidentiary fortress against this exact moment, and she had hidden it in a place only I would ever look, because only I knew the Bible was her most guarded possession. The tape, when I later played it on a borrowed VCR at a library media lab that converted analog to digital, showed my mother reading the letter aloud, holding that day's newspaper with the date clearly visible in the frame, and adding, "Claire, I'm so sorry for what they'll try to do. Use everything I've left you. Somebody has to stop them. I love you. I'll see you when you get here." She was wearing the same tiger's pennant in the background. Her voice was steady, the voice of the librarian who had once stared down a school board that wanted to ban a book. The librarian at the media lab, a kind woman named Doris, helped me transfer the video to a DVD and a digital file, and she did not ask any questions when I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The notarized letter was my dead man's switch. It did not activate automatically. It required me to find it and present it to the right person, and the right person, I discovered, was already waiting. Harold Harleys was a white-haired estate litigator with an office in a converted Victorian near the county courthouse, a man who spoke in trust codes and probate statutes the way I speak in stud spacing and load calculations. When I called the number on the letterhead in the envelope, his receptionist put me through immediately, and his first words were, "I've been expecting your call, Claire. Your mother came to see me after Elaine's first attempt to have her declared incompetent failed. I have a file on this. Let's stop them properly." I met him the next day in his conference room, a space lined with law books that smelled of leather and old paper, the kind of room where decisions get made in permanent ink. Harleys explained what I had already feared. The fraudulent Hellock had clouded the title, and the new will had been filed with the probate court by Elaine's strip mall document preparer. To unwind it, we needed a trifecta: the video evidence of coercion, the notarized counterletter, and proof that Brett and Elaine had personally forged the credit application with intent to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony in our state. That last piece required evidence from inside Brett's business records, because the bank compliance officer Harleys had contacted, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo at First Midwest Trust, had flagged the Cayman transfers as potential structuring under the Bank Secrecy Act, but she lacked the direct link to the Hellock application, signed in my name. Patricia could subpoena the records eventually, but that would give Brett time to destroy digital files, to wipe hard drives and shred the very documents I had already partially reconstructed. What we needed was a forensic extraction of Brett's desktop hard drive before he scrubbed it, and for that, I would need to become an inside operative. Patricia Okonkwo was not what I expected. She was a banker who quoted federal sentencing guidelines from memory, and who wore a navy suit with a subtle pinstripe that looked like it had been tailored in a city where people take fabric seriously. We met at a diner called The Griddle, a 24-hour place with vinyl booths and a jukebox that only played Patsy Cline. She brought a small USB device in her purse, a black rectangular block with a male USB connector on one end and a small LED on the other. It was a write blocker with a preloaded data cloning tool, she explained, a forensic imager that would create a bit-for-bit copy of the target drive without altering any file metadata or leaving a digital footprint detectable by consumer antivirus. The model was a Tableau T8U, commonly used by law enforcement. She walked me through the procedure on a paper napkin, drawing the steps in blue ballpoint. insert the device, boot into the target's operating system, locate the drive, execute the hidden batch file that Patricia had already pre-configured on the USB, wait for the LED to stop flashing and turn solid green, then remove the device and reboot the computer to clear any event logs from the USB insertion. The whole operation would take 3 minutes, assuming the computer was not password protected and I did not trip a hidden camera. She gave me the USB wrapped in a napkin, and she told me, "Claire, if you get caught, I'll have to deny we ever met. But I don't think you'll get caught. Your mother was a very thorough woman." She also showed me how to check for the hidden batch file by browsing the USB's directory structure on her laptop. The script was disguised as a Windows diagnostic utility, its icon a generic gear. I practiced the insertion and ejection movements in my head over and over until I could do them in the dark by feel alone. The window came 3 days later. Elaine and Brett announced they were attending the annual gala for the Regional Car Wash Association, a black tie fundraiser at a hotel ballroom downtown, the kind of event where Brett would work the room like a politician, while Elaine posted filtered photos of crystal chandeliers and captioned them, "Grateful for our community." They would be out from 7 in the evening until at least midnight. I wished them a lovely time, and I watched from the window as the Escalade's taillights disappeared down the cul-de-sac. Then I waited 30 minutes in case they had forgotten anything and circled back. When the house remained silent except for the soft tick of the clock on the mantel, I moved. The office lock took 15 seconds this time. I was getting faster. The computer on the desk was an older Dell Optiplex, a tower unit that hummed like a refrigerator compressor. I pressed the power button and the screen flickered to a Windows login screen. Password required. I had anticipated this. Over the past week, I had made a point of standing in the kitchen when Brett typed his password, always with his back to me, but the sliding glass door to the patio acted like a mirror in the evening light, reflecting the keyboard. He typed one-handed slowly, and I had watched the pattern, a capital C followed by a lowercase ARSHIN, then the number 1 and an exclamation point. Car shine 1. The arrogance of a man who thinks no one is watching is a structural weakness, like a beam notched too deep for a pipe. I typed the password. The desktop loaded, a background image of a shiny sedan emerging from a foam tunnel. I inserted the USB device, and the operating system made the soft chime of a new device recognized. I opened the File Explorer, navigated to the USB drive, and double-clicked the batch file Patricia had named Diagnostic Tool. BAT. A black command prompt window opened, text scrolling too fast to read, and the LED on the USB started flashing amber, then green in faster pulses. I watched the clock in the corner of the screen. 1 minute, 2 minutes, and then from the front of the house, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, the low mechanical whir of the garage door opener engaging. Elaine and Brett had come back. I heard the Escalade's engine rumble, then cut off, and car doors slamming. Brett's voice, muffled but distinct, said, "I can't believe I forgot the cufflinks. They'll notice if I'm not wearing the family crest." Elaine's heels clicked on the garage floor, and then the interior door opened, and their voices entered the kitchen, not 30 feet from where I sat. The green LED on the USB was still flashing, not yet solid. I had perhaps another minute before the clone was complete. I scooped up the USB, the cord still trailing, and I held the power button on the tower, forcing a hard shutdown. The screen went black instantly. I ducked under the desk, curling my body into the knee-hole space, my tool roll pressing against my ribs. The office door was closed but not locked. I had not relocked it after entering. I heard Brett's footsteps in the hallway, then the creak of the master bedroom door. Elaine's voice, "Honey, did you leave the computer on in the office? I thought I heard the fan." My heart slammed against my sternum. Brett replied from the bedroom, "Probably just the HVAC. Grab my cufflinks from the dresser and let's go." I held my breath, my lungs burning, and listened as their footsteps retreated. The garage door opened again, and the Escalade backed out. I waited 5 minutes, counting the seconds in my head before crawling out from under the desk. I restarted the computer, ran the cloning process again from the beginning, and this time the LED turned solid green after 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I safely ejected the USB, tucked it into my waistband, and rebooted the machine, selecting Restart from the Start menu, then forced a second shutdown to clear any logs. I relocked the office, walked back to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands shaking. The clone captured everything, I would later learn. The QuickBooks company file showing the flow of HELOC funds directly into Car Shine Holdings' operating account, the spreadsheet with draw schedules and exact dates, the scanned PDF of my forged signature, with metadata revealing it, had been composited from 2 separate documents using a consumer PDF editor, and the email correspondence with Lori Bienkowski in which Brett explicitly instructed her to backdate the notarization to August 3rd and forget to log it in your journal. There's a bonus for you in this. I delivered the USB to Patricia that same night, meeting her in the parking lot of the Griddle under the flicker of a sodium lamp. She took it in a sealed evidence bag, thanked me with a nod, and drove away. I still needed to test the depths of their cruelty, to know for myself that no residual familial instinct remained. The staged collapse was a gambit Harleys had suggested in a moment of dark humor, but I seized on it. I needed to see them in an unguarded moment of perceived crisis, choose the documents over my life. The test was not for the court, it was for me. I needed to cauterize whatever last nerve of sisterly feeling might still be twitching. It was a Sunday afternoon. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of a pool pump and the occasional beep of Elaine's phone. I had been kneeling in the guest bathroom, pretending to check the cork bead on the base of the toilet I had reset after the plumbing repair. Through the wall, I heard Elaine on the phone with a realtor, a woman named Patricia something, not Okonkwo, a local agent with a reputation for flipping foreclosures. "Claire's barely functional," Elaine said, her voice carrying that particular pitch of casual cruelty. "We can have her out of here by Christmas, and the house on Sycamore should list at $390 if we stage it right. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her, trust me." I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked into the great room. Brett was at the kitchen island, reviewing something on his tablet, a stylus in his hand. Elaine was leaning against the counter, phone still pressed to her ear. I let my knees buckle. I had practiced the collapse in my mind a dozen times, the way I had once practiced falling from a ladder during a safety certification, tucking my chin and letting my body go limp. I hit the travertine floor with a sound that was more thud than crack, my shoulder taking the impact, my head bouncing once but protected by my arm. I lay there, eyes open but unfocused, and I began making my breaths shallow and ragged, a series of wet gasps that mimicked the respiratory pattern of someone going into shock. I twitched once, a full body spasm, and then went still except for the breathing. Brett looked up from his tablet. He did not drop it. He did not call out. He took one step toward the kitchen counter where a manila envelope sat, the same one containing the final probate paperwork they needed me to sign, a waiver of citation and a consent to probate. He said, his voice calm and practical, "Elaine, find her phone and delete any messages to that lawyer. I'll get the envelope off the counter." Elaine came around the corner, saw me sprawled on the floor, and did not kneel. She did not check my airway. She said, "Is she actually unconscious or just being dramatic? She's always been so theatrical." Brett stepped over my leg, his leather loafer grazing the fabric of my jeans, a casual contact that felt like a door slamming. He grabbed the envelope, held it to his chest, and then turned back to look at me. I let my eyes close. I held my breath until my lungs burned, a full 30 seconds, counting the beats. I heard Elaine say, "If she stops breathing, we call the non-emergency line, not 911. The last thing we need is a paramedic report with a description of the scene. That could trigger a whole Adult Protective Services investigation. We'll just say she had a fall, we found her, and we did CPR until they arrived, but only after we've secured the paperwork." Brett said, "Agreed. Let's wait and see. If she actually dies, we can have the body cremated before anyone asks questions. People will believe grief killed her." The casualness of his tone, as if he were discussing the logistics of ordering a new sofa, made my stomach clench. I waited a full 60 seconds before I let myself stir, groaning and blinking, feigning confusion in the way I had seen patients do when coming out of sedation. By that time, they had positioned themselves at the kitchen island, glasses of white wine poured, discussing whether to stage the bungalow with mid-century modern pieces or farmhouse chic to maximize the listing price. I got up slowly, steadied myself on the back of the sofa, and said, "I think I just forgot to eat, must be low blood sugar." Neither of them offered me a single cracker. Neither of them said, "Are you okay?" Elaine said, "Maybe you should lie down, Claire, you look pale." Her tone was the one you used to shoo a stray cat off the porch. I walked back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Whatever shared blood we had, it had been drained and replaced by the cold saline of Brett's balance sheet. I was no longer their sister. I was an obstacle with a pulse, and I now had the authorization I needed to treat them as exactly that. The final filament of hope that some sliver of decency remained in my sister had snapped, and in its place was a cold, clean clarity. I would not flinch. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Mom's funeral. Elaine told me we had an appointment at First Midwest Trust to finalize the estate. She presented it as a simple administrative step. I would sign a document acknowledging the new will and waiving any right to contest, and in exchange they would, generously, allow me to keep my mother's personal jewelry, a pearl necklace and a small garnet ring that had been our grandmother's. I dressed in the sweater set Elaine had laid out for me, a pale pink cardigan and shell that made me look like a woman who had been so thoroughly defeated she would wear whatever she was told, a costume designed to telegraph compliance to the bank officers. I let them drive me in Brett's Escalade, the leather seats cool and smelling of chemical cleaner. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my purse containing only a lip balm and my phone, already preset to vibrate on silent mode, in case Harold Harley's needed to reach me. I watched the streetlights blink past, the autumn leaves skittering across the asphalt, and my heart beat steady as a metronome, the way it does when a framing crew finally steps back to admire a perfectly plumb wall. The bank's private conference room was down a hallway off the main lobby, past the teller windows and through a door with a biometric keypad. It was not what Elaine and Brett expected. Patricia Okonkwo sat at the head of the polished walnut table, her laptop open in front of her, her expression neutral and professional. Harold Harley sat to her left, a leather briefcase of documents at his elbow, his glasses perched on his nose. Two men in dark suits with identically neutral posture stood against the far wall, their hands clasped in front of them, and I recognized the subtle bulge of shoulder holsters under their jackets. They were FBI agents from the white-collar crime division, Agents Miller and Chen, whom I had met briefly the day before in Harley's office. I had been told they would be present. Elaine and Brett, however, saw only what they wanted to see, bank executives perhaps, or Harley's assistants. Brett started his performance immediately, shaking hands with a vigor that bordered on aggressive, thanking everyone for making this easy for the family. He slid the probate paperwork across the polished table toward me, a pen already uncapped and placed on top like a ceremonial dagger. The document was titled Waiver of Citation and Consent to Probate of Will. Elaine smiled, a tight rictus of rehearsed warmth, and said, "It's such a relief to put this behind us, isn't it, Claire? Mom would want us to move on." I looked at the paper. I did not touch it. "I'm not signing anything that puts my name on a fraudulent credit line you opened with a forged signature," I said. My voice was low and even, the same voice I used when explaining to a subcontractor why their framing was half an inch out of square, and they would need to tear it down and start over. The words hung in the air like a chalk line snapped onto concrete. Brett's smile froze. Elaine's face went through a rapid series of micro-expressions. Confusion first, a furrow of her brows, then a flash of genuine fear that showed in the whitening of her knuckles around the pen, and then a practiced anger that settled over her features like a mask she had been keeping in her pocket. "What are you talking about, Claire? You're confused. The grief has clearly broken something in your mind. We've been so worried about you," she said, reaching for the pen herself as if she could simply sign for me. I placed my palm flat on the papers, the ink cool under my skin. Patricia Okonkwo opened her laptop and turned it to face the room. On the screen was a paused video frame of my mother's face, the image from the second tape, the one from the safety deposit box. Patricia pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the room, reading the notarized letter aloud. "Any document signed after July 15th without Harold Harley's present is void." The newspaper she held showed the date clearly, September 12th, the headline something about a local bond initiative. Her voice was fierce, unwavering, nothing like the medicated whisper from the first tape. The room seemed to shrink. Then Patricia advanced the presentation. The next slide was a split-screen comparison. On the left, my real signature on a contractor's lien waiver from a job I had finished in July, and on the right, the forged signature on the HELOC application, with red circles highlighting the inconsistent letter forms, the extra loop on my capital C, the missing downward slash on the T. It shifted to a wire transfer log showing $47,000 moving from the HELOC account at First Midwest Trust to Car Shine Holdings account at the Cayman National Bank, the transaction date matching the forged application by 2 days. The next slide displayed the reconstructed email chain between Brett and Lori Bienkowski. The words backdate the notarization to August 3rd, highlighted in yellow, along with Brett's reply, "I'll include an extra $500 for your trouble. Delete this after." The final slide was a summary of the QuickBooks data I had cloned, showing the HELOC funds had been used to make payments on the delinquent timeshare loan and 3 overdue car wash equipment leases. Agent Miller stepped forward, his badge now visible on a chain around his neck, and he identified himself by name and bureau. He began reciting the Miranda warning, his voice practiced and flat, as his partner Agent Chen turned Brett around and cuffed his wrists with a pair of black ratcheting restraints. Brett did not say a word. His face went grey, the colour of drywall compound before it fully sets, the colour of a man who has just realised his entire architecture of lies had been built on a foundation of sand while the building inspector was watching the whole time. Elaine screamed. It was not a scream of grief or shock. It was a sound of pure animalistic fury, the kind of sound a feral cat makes when it is cornered. She lunged across the table, her manicured nails scrabbling from my face, and Agent Chen intercepted her with a restraint hold that pinned her arm behind her back. She writhed, her heels scraping the carpet, and she shrieked, "You planned this. You pathetic little martyr, you've been scheming this whole time while we took you into our home." I stood up slowly and adjusted the cuffs of the pink sweater set I loathed. I met her eyes. "I learned from the best," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Mom always taught me to carry a punch list and check every single line item. You missed a few." The aftermath was procedural, and it unfolded over the next 14 months like a long, satisfying backfill of concrete poured into the hole they had dug. The federal prosecutor charged Brett with wire fraud, bank fraud, elder exploitation, conspiracy, and money laundering, a stack of counts that carried a potential sentence of up to 30 years. Elaine was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and being an accessory after the fact. The strip mall document preparer cut a deal, testifying that Brett had paid him $500 to print the will on the correct paper stock, and to walk Elaine through the signing process without ever verifying that the signatory was competent. Lori Bienkowski surrendered her notary commission voluntarily to avoid felony charges and agreed to testify, admitting she had never met my mother, had never witnessed a signature, and had simply stamped the document because her brother asked her to. The probate court invalidated the fraudulent will in a hearing that lasted 40 minutes, Harold Harley's presenting the notarized letter and the video evidence on a portable DVD player. The judge, a woman with reading glasses on a chain and a voice like dry gravel, barely looked up before striking the document from the record and ordering the original will, dated 1998, and leaving everything to me reinstated. The fraudulent HELOC was frozen by First Midwest Trust, and the lender, after being presented with the FBI's evidence, initiated a full rescission of the loan, meaning it was wiped from existence as if it had never been issued, a legal remedy available under the Truth in Lending Act for loans procured through fraud. However, because the loan had briefly gone into default during the rescission process, a technicality in the automated reporting system triggered a sheriff's foreclosure auction on the Sycamore Street property before the rescission could finalize. It was a quirk of mortgage servicing law. Once a foreclosure filing begins, even if the underlying debt is fraudulent, the county auction can only be stopped by paying the principal in full, and I did not have that cash yet. The opening bid was set by the county's algorithm at $85,000, roughly 52% of the assessed value, a number designed to attract investors. I attended the auction wearing my own clothes, a pair of clean jeans and a flannel shirt, the same one I had worn the day I had framed the sunroom on the back of the bungalow. I had a cashier's check in my purse for $85,000, drawn on the proceeds of the civil suit. The suit, which Harley's had filed on my behalf while the criminal case was pending, sought caregiver reimbursement, restitution for the $90,000 in documented expenses, and damages for emotional distress and fraud. The jury heard my mother's video testimony, saw the receipts she had organized, and listened to Patricia Okonkwo explain the forensic accounting in terms even I could follow. They deliberated for 7 minutes. The verdict awarded me $150,000, plus legal fees and costs. I paid Harley's out of my settlement, and the remainder was enough to cover the auction bid with a cushion for the coming renovation. The auction was held in the county courthouse lobby, a marble-floored atrium with a vaulted ceiling and terrible acoustics. The auctioneer, a retired attorney in a tweed jacket, read the property description in a rapid monotone while a small crowd of flippers and investors shuffled their feet. I raised my paddle, number 42, a laminated square on a stick. No one else bid. The room was silent except for the hum of a floor buffer. The auctioneer slammed his gavel on the portable podium, and the clerk recorded the sale to Claire Bennett in fee simple absolute, free and clear of all liens. I walked out of that courthouse with the keys already in my pocket, the same keys I had had on my ring for 15 years, and I drove back to Sycamore Street alone, the autumn sun warm on the windshield. What I did next was the only possible answer to what had been done. The bungalow had always been configured for accessibility. but I expanded its purpose. I applied for a state license to operate a small residential care facility for the elderly, a Type C facility that could house up to 6 residents. The licensing process took 6 months, involving fire marshal inspections of the sprinkler system I had installed and hardwired smoke detectors I had wired into the panel, zoning hearings, where I stood before the Planning Commission and explained my intent, and a commercial kitchen upgrade that required a Type I grease hood and an ANSI-certified exhaust system. I pulled the permits myself, framed the new kitchen bump-out by laying out the top and bottom plates with my framing square, ran the ductwork through the attic with rigid galvanized steel, and scheduled city inspections with the same matter-of-fact efficiency I had brought to 100 job sites. I hired 2 licensed vocational nurses, a part-time social worker, and a cook who specialized in soft diets. I renamed the house Rosewood Cottage, an assisted living home, and I painted the front door a cheerful geranium red, the color my mother had always wanted but never dared. I vetted every resident personally. The first to move in was a woman named Margaret, whose son lived 3 states away and visited once a year on Mother's Day if the flights were cheap. Then came Ed, a retired postal carrier whose daughter had stopped answering her phone after he had signed over his house to her as an early inheritance. Then 2 sisters, Leona and Florence, who had no family left at all. Then a retired carpenter named Frank, whose story echoed mine. His son had sold Frank's house out from under him using a power of attorney that was legally questionable, a document signed while Frank was recovering from a stroke. Frank arrived with a single toolbox and a sadness he wore like a heavy coat. We rebuilt the back deck together on weekends, him planing old-growth fir boards and me nailing them into place with the ring-shank nails that hold better over time. We talked about the grain of the wood, the dignity of a well-driven fastener, and the strange arithmetic of a family that subtracts what it should multiply. He once told me, as we sat on the finished deck watching the birds at the feeder, that the worst part wasn't the theft itself, it was the way his son had looked at him when he signed, like Frank had already ceased to exist as a person and become merely a problem to be solved. And I named a wing. The North Addition, a sunroom I built with my own hands, with windows on 3 sides and a view of the tomato garden, became a gathering space for morning coffee and afternoon card games. I mounted a brass plaque beside the door, at eye level, ordered from a trophy shop downtown. It reads, "Elaine's wing for those who were forgotten by the people who should have loved them most." Every time a new resident asks about the name, I tell them the truth. That it was my sister, and that her neglect, her schemes, and her desperate scramble to steal what was not hers funded this place in a way she never intended, in a way she would have hated. They nod slowly, the way old people do when they have lived long enough to know that the worst betrayals can sometimes be rebarred into the strongest foundations. Brett is serving 7 years at a federal correctional institution in Terre Haute, assigned to a unit for non-violent financial offenders, though I have heard from Harley's probation contact that he has been assigned to kitchen duty, cleaning the industrial grease traps, a task that requires a hazmat suit and a pressure washer. The Escalade went back to the leasing company. The McMansion was seized by the bank and sold at a loss, the proceeds barely covering the first mortgage. Elaine was sentenced to 5 years at a women's facility upstate, where her daily schedule includes mandatory financial ethics courses and cognitive behavioral therapy for personality disorders, a regimen she apparently finds insulting and beneath her, according to a letter she sent to our cousin that somehow made its way to me. I did not attend the sentencing, but Harold Harley's sent me the transcript, and I read every word of the victim impact statement I had submitted. It ended with a single line, "I forgive them not for their sake, but because carrying anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die, and I have better things to pour my energy into now." I meant it. The forgiveness is not for them, it is for me, a release of the liens they had filed on my heart. Last week, Rosie, our most recent resident, asked me why I named the sunroom after someone who hurt me. We were sitting in Elaine's wing, the morning light falling in long rectangles across the floor, and she was holding a cup of tea with both hands, her fingers wrapped around the warmth the way my mother used to hold her mug on cold mornings. I told her that forgetting is dangerous, but remembering can be turned into something useful, like taking a scrap of worthless land and replanting it with something that bears fruit. She nodded, and we sat in a comfortable silence, the kind my mother and I used to share. Outside, the tomatoes were ripening, bright red against the green stakes. I had a punch list for the next day, a loose handrail on the back ramp that needed tightening, and I had promised Frank I would help him fix the squeaky hinge on his closet door. But for that moment, I just sat in the sun and listened to the quiet hum of a house that had become exactly what it was always supposed to be, a place where people who had been abandoned could be found. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories where the quiet caretaker gets justice, hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.